Hi, everyone. My name is Marko Kangrga. I'm the head of quant research at RavenPack. This 30-minute session, feel free to make it as interactive as you like. Flip on the camera, ask any questions as they come to you. In the meantime, just maybe keep yourself on mute to eliminate any background noise, but feel free to jump in whenever you have a question. Might have been a little too aggressive with the amount of content, so we have 30 minutes. Going to jam through this relatively quickly. So let's jump right in. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to touch briefly on some neural network basics and ML applications specific to sequence models. And I'll describe a sample neural network structure and train a very simple network to predict a sentiment score and an event given an input sentence. And then if we have time, we'll talk about some rules-based approaches, why people might want to use them, and show some of the use cases around that. And then again, if we have time, we'll wrap up with the discussion of some key issues, an example of kind of this real-world low latency production system, and jump right in. So for those who are not familiar with the concept, it's kind of worth brushing up on some neural network basics. You often see large neural network diagrams with kind of a bunch of nodes and neurons, but underlying this is actually a fairly basic intuition. And here, for example, we have a toy model for, say, house price prediction. And here we start with 4 basic inputs. Each one affects the last value y, which is the house price. And each input is weighted by a coefficient, and we add a bias term at the end, which is kind of just like any linear regression, and it has that intercept term at the end. So this function gets us the value of A1. And to start, we initialize the weights and biases effectively at random. And with one hidden layer, as shown here, we apply the same function to each of the 3 nodes, then continue doing the same until we get to Y. And this is what we call forward propagation. This would still actually be a linear function, but until we apply an activation function. And the activation function kind of adds a nonlinearity to the model and makes it nonlinear effectively, which is what where the power of neural networks really lie. And there are several of these activation functions. One of the most popular ones is rectified linear unit, ReLU. Here in this case, we'll just use a sigmoid function, which effectively squashes whatever output we get from the inner function to a value between 0 and 1. Kind of the basics, but this would be an example of a kind of large neural network diagram, which is basically a larger version of what we saw in the previous slide. Has an input layer, then 2 hidden layers, 1 output layer, and in this case, just a single target variable, but it could be as many as you'd like. What we do, we take one node as an example. We apply the function to the inputs using randomly initialized weights and biases at first. And you can think of it as kind of like those linear regressions as we apply activation function to make the model nonlinear. And then what we do is we look for the difference of the final output and the value we get, so y hat, to the true value y using a cost function or loss function, which is really just a method of evaluating how well our algorithm fits the data set. And so given this error between the predicted and true values of y, we can propagate that error backwards in subsequent passes called epochs usually, and nudge the weights and biases in a way that gets our predicted value y hat closer to the true value of y. And this is called backpropagation. So the true magic here is that for each of the underlying functions, we can figure out the optimal direction and magnitude of the nudges by applying the chain rule of calculus and taking the derivatives of the cost function relative to the network's layers. So it's good to have some intuition around what's happening under the hood in these deep learning models, but as we'll see, most of this hard work is already done for us through the frameworks that we'll discuss in a bit. So today we'll focus specifically on sequence models, which are typically temporal models where input X might depend on prior information. So we need a kind of a structure to keep track of these sequences for some period of time. And models like the recurrent neural networks, or RNNs, have done a pretty good job transforming speech recognition, various natural language tasks, and kind of even music generation. So here's just some of the examples and how it's been used. Sentiment classification has been an obvious one because you can input X as a sequence and output a single number. They've been used in DNA sequence analysis, machine translation, etc. So to kind of look at what these structures look like, can home in on some of them. You have that, for example, one-to-many models, which you can think of as kind of music generation or image recognition. You present an image, outcomes a single image, which is a single output, and outcomes a sentence that describes the image. Sentiment classification is a very typical example of a many-to-one. You input a series of tokens or words, and outcomes a single sentiment score. Machine translation is an obvious many-to-many. Google Translate is a pretty clear example of that. But let's talk briefly about the kind of simplest form of sequence models, the RNNs, recurrent neural networks. And they are, or rather were, heavily used for sequential data, such as time series or natural language modeling. And kind of all recurrent neural networks have this form of a chain repeating modules of a neural network. And they're often shown, as you see it here on the left, kind of that one squiggly node. But I find it more intuitive if we unfold it into this chain representation on the right. And what we're doing really doing here is that we're feeding inputs in a sequential manner, such as words or time series data, and can try to remember the state of the network as we go by passing the output of the previous node to the next one. And as already mentioned, the input can be either a single value or another sequence of values. So in this case, just as an example sentence, take Iran threatens to breach nuclear deal enrichment limits. It was a headline at the time. And what we want to do is keep track of the words as they are as we pass them through the network. But the way, how do we actually do it? We obviously cannot feed words into an ML algorithm. We need to feed some semblance of a number. So the way it was initially done, and is to some extent not a concept anymore, is we would take the dictionary of, say, 400,000 in this case, a dictionary of 400,000 tokens and words in this case. And what we would do is we would map each word within that dictionary to its ID, to its index within the dictionary. So in this case, so Iran threatens to breach, etc., we would actually map each word to its place. So Iran would be index number 192, 561, etc. And now all of a sudden we have some numerical representation of the words. It's called the one-hot encoding. And it's simplest form of doing this sort of numerical representation, but it can take actually quite a long time for the network to infer meaning from this type of input. And we'll see a better way to do that later on. But sometimes kind of what we need to do is to maintain context for a longer period. And if you kind of consider trying to predict the last word in a sentence like, I grew up in Italy, ... I speak fluent Italian. So that kind of information we need to be able to translate and remember it for a longer period. And it's entirely possible for kind of the gap to be bridged with simple RNNs, but it can take quite a long time and it's very unstable. And the RNNs just generally become unable to learn and connect that information as these sequences get longer and longer. So, and the reason is these outputs are strongly influenced by nearby inputs, and it's generally difficult for that error at the very end that we're trying to minimize to back propagate all the way to the back of the sequence and modify the weights and biases. So in come the long short-term memory networks, or LSTMs. So there's still kind of that chain sequence structure, but LSTMs are kind of a special kind of RNN, which is basically designed to learn these long-term dependencies. And the RNNs of NLRNNs, you can see, has a very simple structure inside, simple hyperbolic tangent function that squashes the output of the previous node and the input between between minus one and one. But the key to LSTMs is in this structure called the cell state. And it's this kind of horizontal line that you see here running along the network and along the entire sequence we implement some modifications along the way. And without getting too deep in the math, the LSTM kind of has that ability to remove and add information to the cell state using what are called gates. And it's basically a way to optionally let information through. And they're composed of sigmoid neural network layer and pointwise multiplication operation. So FT, for example, is the forget layer. It's just a float vector of numbers between 0 and 1, with 0 saying we completely want to forget this, 1 saying let's remember this further on. IT and CT add new information, etc. But the reality is it's really just kind of a series of matrix multiplications as we go along, with a couple of inputs along with a couple of outputs that are passed to the next cell, along with the output of that cell that can be passed to the remainder of the algorithm. So, for example, what it might do is output whether a subject is singular or plural, and we see a new subject in a sentence, we might want to forget the gender of the prior subject. But I think it's actually worth mentioning an important advancement that's widely used in transfer learning, which is word embeddings. And these word embeddings are pre-trained vector representations of words, which are extracted from unsupervised training models. So kind of the idea is to map human language into a geometric space. And here training is generally performed on aggregated word co-occurrence statistics from a very large corpus, called like Wikipedia. And the resulting representations are supposed to embody linear substructures of this word vector space. So in essence, what we have as an output is a matrix where each word is represented by a long vector of numbers that are supposed to embed meaning and context. And what's generally fascinating is that we can run word comparisons out of the box by simply looking at the similarity of these vectors and come up with word analogy games without any further training. But really the true power comes from using these embeddings when creating deep neural networks, and where we benefit from training speed and pre-trained context. So instead of looking up that index 1 versus all the zeros in our input, we're going to look up this vector representation, numerical series that represent a word or a token. But as I've already kind of hinted, modern frameworks like TensorFlow and Keras API simplified what used to be a highly complex and tedious way of doing deep learning. And this is just a very simple example of how we would visualize a simple neural network model. We have the X inputs. We're passing them through this embedding layer that gives us back the vector representation of the tokens, so words. Then we pass it through an LSTM layer, which we described in the previous slides. And then it goes through something called the dropout layer, which basically forces it to forget some of the connections within the network in order to regularize, so that it doesn't overfit the model. And then we pass it through another LSTM, pass it through another dropout so that we regularize the data so it doesn't overfit. Then a dense layer basically just squashes it, in this case, to a single point, single numerical value. Then we squash between -1 and 1, and we get sentiment. And it's basically just a few lines of code with Keras and TensorFlow. And we'll go through this in the actual notebook. But what we basically do is we define the embedding layer. We say that it's not trainable because we already get this matrix representation of our corpus of tokens. And then we feed the weights to that layer. And then we just proceed to stack these layers to create a model. We pass as the first step the embedding layer. Then we pass the output from the embedding layer, which is going to be a sequence of numbers, through the LSTM. Then we return sequences, which means I want back the outputs out of each cell within the network. Then we pass it through the dropout, as I mentioned, through another LSTM layer, but instead here we're not going to return sequences, we're going to return one numerical value. Then that value also goes through the dropout, goes through that dense layer, which is a perceptron, just a single node, where we apply the activation function hyperbolic tangent to squash it between -1 and 1. And then we define the optimizer, which is a stochastic gradient descent, in this case, Atom. And it's just a way to backpropagate and learn the weights and biases as we train the model. So what we're going to do is just do that. Here is a notebook that shows some of these concepts in practice. What we're going to do here is we're going to grab one of the embedding matrices, in this case, the glove embedding matrix, which is open source, can be freely downloaded at Stanford's website. And we're just going to take a quick look at what that looks like once it loads. It's a large one with 6 billion tokens, 300 dimensions. So each token representation is going to be a 300-dimensional vector. It's unusual that it's taking this long. There we go. Yeah, so in this case, to a slimmer version, there are 400,000 tokens and a 300-dimensional vector for each word representation. So just to sample it here, we can kind of see this is just a random sample. Let's get something that's a bit more reasonable, like resting, for example. Resting token has this vector representation this unsupervised model learned while going through the corpus. So what that allows us to do is we can compare each one of the tokens to each other. So in this case, we can use cosine similarity to compare vectors. And the way that it's done is we can see, for example, that France and Italy are quite similar when we compare the vectors from the embedding matrix. Ball and crocodile, not similar. So cosine 0, and they're basically fully orthogonal. Whereas France is to Paris, as Rome is to Italy, actually has an opposite meaning. France is a country, and Italy is here the country on the other side of the comparison. So what we can do is we can here check how that works. We define the cosine similarity method. We run the cosine similarity on France and Italy, and here we get a similarity of 0.56 because they're both countries. Ball and crocodile, basically 0. And here, if we subtract Paris vector from France and then compare it to the difference between Italy and Rome, we see that they're actually opposite. So what we can do here is play a word analogy game, just kind of show how powerful this is straight out of the box. And what we're going to do is we're going to say Paris is to France as London is to, and then let the network guess. And what it's going to do is look for the smallest difference between the next word we're going to compare. Or it runs through the entire dictionary to compare. And straight out of the box, it does actually quite well. It learned these geometric representations of words and is able to infer this word analogy result. And it does this across countries. It can, man is to king as woman is to queen. And threw in one just for fun, apple is to juice as mother is to, it's going to give you a result. It's always going to spit out something. So it's always best to be used as a transfer learning approach, because we can refine it further depending on our specific use case. So what we're going to do here is we're going to load up some news data. I'm going to see what that looks like. So we have a bunch of different sentences, and they're tagged with sentiment scores. So this is going to be our training set, text, and sentiment is going to be our target. So what we need to do is actually, we need to create a tokenizer. The tokenizer is, it's basically just a method that takes a string and breaks it down into tokens. That's really what that method does. It can be quite complex in the way we want to represent it. So if there are numerical values, we might want to extract those numerical values. And there are some off-the-shelf tokenizers that we can also use. But what it also does in this case is converts tokens to IDs, so they're index representations within the matrix. So then we can look those up. We start with Tokenizer, which this particular dictionary doesn't know what it is, so it assigns kind of an average token. But then all the other words are looked up, and their representations are fed back. So what we want to do is we want to feed this into our neural network. So in this case, I define a couple other methods that take a string, convert it to IDs, and decode does the opposite. So once we have those, we actually can go through the entire data set and pre-process it such that we get back these indexes of the words. And I'm doing here a little bit of multiprocessing because it is a larger data set. So now it's plowing through it, and we'll take a look at what that looks like once it's translated. My machine is slow today. There we go. So we get these indexes, all the tokens within each sentence. And if we decode that, we get the representation of these words that the machine actually sees from a numeric standpoint. But in order to feed this into our neural network, we need to translate it into preset lengths. So the neural network is expecting a preset length. So what we're going to do is we're going to pad the sequences so that lengths are always the same. And now we are going to build the model that we talked about. We already described what we're going to do. We're going to use 128 neurons for our LSTM layers. And here we get the description of what it is. So what's great here is we can see that there are a total of 19 million parameters, including weights and biases. But we are only training 350 of them because we kept the embedding layer weights frozen. So here what we do is we just prepare the training and validation sets, and then we can fit the model or not. Because we already provide the validation. So instead, we can automatically tell it we've split it into 20%. But here, we're just going to validate on this many examples. So what it's doing now is it's training. You can see the loss decreasing and the R squared of the sentiment score increasing. And it says it's going to take 24 minutes to finish this first epoch. But I already pre-trained this model on the cloud using GPUs. So, and it was taking something like 69 seconds per epoch, so quite quick. Instead, I'm going to load the model, define a function that does all of that pre-processing, padding, etc. And we're going to try and predict a few sentences. So, for example, Theranos CEO Holmes accused of fraud. That's negative. IBM misses earnings expectations, negative. Morgan Stanley analyst initiates coverage with an overweight. That's positive. So these are all, the network learned from the data set that we provided. And here, QB Insurance downgraded to hold from buy by Bell Potter. And what's interesting here is if we take downgraded to sell from buy, the sentiment goes grossly negative. And this is one of the kind of stronger events from a market reaction perspective. And then super quickly, what we're going to do here is instead of having a single output as that's sentiment, we're going to try and predict the category of the event. So we're going to, again, load the data. And we are going to visualize it quickly. See, this is like the top. This would be the topic. Analyst ratings change for that. There's a, in this case, it's a subsample relates to analyst changes. But again, what we're going to do is we're going to create a one-hot encoding of all the topics. There are 220 of them here. And here, it's a slightly different approach. We create a network that uses the functional Keras API. So it gives us a little bit more flexibility in terms of structuring the network. And it allows us to create two outputs instead of one. And is just a little bit more of a flexible way of accomplishing what you need to accomplish. So here we can also see, quite a bit fewer trainable parameters. We prepare train validation sets. Prevent this from stopping us. And we can fit the model. Again, it's going to take a little while. So we're going to stop it. And instead, we're going to load the model that I already pre-trained, define that function for pre-processing the data that we want to predict. So tokenizing, padding the sequences, and try and predict a couple sentences. So for example, Groupon said CEO stepped down as chief executive. It notices it's an executive resignation with a negative sentiment. Chairman of a board sells shares of Roku. That's an insider sell, negative sentiment. Natexis Payments explores takeover, acquisition, bid, positive sentiment because it needs a bit more context. It should probably be a higher sentiment score. IBM misses revenue expectations, obviously revenue, negative score. Morgan Stanley initiates coverage with an overweight, analyst rating set. So it's an initiation of a coverage. Here, upgraded to outperform, analyst ratings change. And here, QB Insurance downgraded, analyst ratings change as well with a negative sentiment. So we were able to accomplish everything in one go here. So that was the quick demo. There were a couple more things I was hoping to cover, but I think we're running out of time. So if we have a few minutes, I can take a few questions. Otherwise, thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah. Marko?
Yes.
Marko, I was just interested in the way you explained. I think this is one of the best explanation. I'm not a techie myself, but you made it quite simpler for me to, understand. I'm sure I need to do more study on it. But my question is very pointed. My question is very pointed. The way I could go through your examples, very specific to your examples, just by making out one or two words, I could see. Obviously, this is a human seeing and interacting, but I could figure out some negative words and myself come to a conclusion that they were probably negative sentiments. I understand the machine is doing it. So is it as simple as, then why does the machine has to go and index all the words? Yeah. That is question number one. And second is there an inherent confirmation bias because you say that there is some kind of a retracing which happens?
Repeat that last bit of the sentence again. Inherent bias.
Is there an inherent bias in such models? Because what you tell me is the machine, the learning model works on some form of a retracing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
yes. Yeah. So the two questions are kind of connected, and the answer is there absolutely is a bias. It's the model is going to be biased to the data set that you actually feed through it. So the bigger the training set, the more balanced the training set, the better. So if, for example, I just fed it all of the analyst ratings, it's only going to know about analyst ratings. So go to something that's way more advanced, like GPT-3. That's one of the more advanced large models, I think 57 billion parameters. That one gets into a slightly different criticism in the sense that you feed it all of the internet. It's going to remember, and you ask it 230 plus 700, what's the math? And it gives you the answer. Has it figured out math, or has it seen that example somewhere and embedded it inside the weights and biases? And that's a legitimate criticism. At what point do you call it intelligence? At what point is it just remembering? Has it read everything and put it in? So absolutely, there's going to be a bias. And there are techniques around it, like regularization, cross-validation, balancing of your data sets that allow you to kind of get around them, but ultimately is going to be reflecting your data set. And try to remember your first question. Yeah, your first question.
Yeah, first was, they were, see, a lot of those were very negative terms in the statements you made. So it was very obvious that even probably you could train a machine to do that. How it identified that they were negative?
Yes, what's interesting about this, like we haven't talked about sentence embeddings, which is a way more powerful way of doing this, but this was a toy example, so we just went through it. But if you give more complex context, such as the analyst did not downgrade a stock.
I was about to come to
Yeah, that's a silly example, but oftentimes, sentences can be quite convoluted and longer. And there are just no rules that can capture that context very well. And these types of network, LSTM, probably not. It would have to be some sort of a transformer model. Those are surprisingly good at figuring out context and unpacking what the sentence is actually trying to say. But ultimately, really comes down to.
I'll give you. The example I had in my mind is, someone says that an analyst says that this company is not going to fail. So both not is negative and fail is also negative. So sometimes people construct the sentence which may inherently, by the way the model is constructed, tend to probably take it towards a conclusion, which is
yeah. And even linguistically, those negations can be handled using rules-based methodologies. But the more complex the sentence gets, the more nuanced, the more it talks about inferences, like something about industrials, let's say an ESG concept, which is a big thing now in finance. Say you have a very negative concept related to pollution that's applied to oil companies versus tech companies. Different levels of different types of sentiment score, because it knows that that inference industrials. And sorry to be a bummer, but I'm being told that Zoom might cut us off. So I hope that answers some of the questions. For any other questions, please feel free to pass them along, and I'll be more than happy to answer them.